All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome into another virtual program with the Schaumburg Library. I'm Chris. I'm your adult programs coordinator here at the library, and I am so excited to be bringing back my friend Stephanie Bohnak, who spoke with us last year for our Night with a Museum series. It just felt like a crime as we are celebrating America 250 to not tap in to our friends at the National First Ladies Library and Museum. So thrilled to bring her back. Before I formally introduce Stephanie and turn the evening over to her, just a few of our friendly Zoom reminders for you all. Oh, someone's getting an echo. Wonder if it's, hopefully if I move that, that'll be less echoey. My brain just shut right off. A few of our friendly Zoom reminders. First, we have our closed captions enabled. So if you would like those, you can turn those on or off as you wish using our Zoom toolbar. If you have any questions for Stephanie this evening, please feel free to throw those in the Q&A. We'll take all questions at the end of the program, but as you think of them, don't hesitate. Throw them on in there. That way we can, um, hmm, there's a lot of echoing. Hopefully it's a me specific thing and I don't talk for most of this, so I apologize. Um, hopefully, hopefully me stopping will fix that. I don't know why I thought the answer to where my brain was over there. It's not. If you have questions, Q&A, obviously you can use the chat or the Q&A if you need to go back and forth with me directly for any technical difficulties you're having, such as an echo. And also, if you're having some extreme Zoom technical difficulties, don't worry. You can actually go over to the library's YouTube page. We are live streaming this program as well for anyone who has difficulties using Zoom. That is my duct tape fix for anything you're experiencing there. All right, I think those are all of my friendly Zoom reminders. So let me quickly introduce Stephanie here and turn the evening over into her care. Stephanie Bohnak serves as the Director of Education and Curatorial Services at the National First Ladies Library and Museum, where she leads educational initiatives, public programs, and interpretive outreach while contributing to exhibit development and collections stewardship. She holds an MA in History and Public History from Bowling Green State University, where she focused on women's history and American enslavement, and a BA in History with minors in Anthropology and Classics from the University of Akron. Bohnak also earned an AS in Culinary Arts from Sullivan University, bringing a multidisciplinary lens to her work. Throughout her career, she has been committed to elevating underrepresented, my gosh, that is a mouthful of a word, narratives and advancing accessible, inclusive historical interpretation. Through research-driven programming, exhibitions, and community engagement, Bohnak works to broaden public understanding of America's First Ladies and their enduring influence on the nation's cultural and political landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie Bohnak.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me this evening. As Chris said, my name is Stephanie Bohnak, and I'm the Director of Education and Curatorial Services for the National First Ladies Library and Museum at the First Ladies National Historic Site in Canton, Ohio. Obviously, right now I can't look at the chat, but if you want to share, if you've visited us before, or if you're a member, I'd love to see that later on. And as Chris said, I do have a degree in culinary arts, so if anyone ever wants to talk food history, you know who to call. I'm so pleased to be welcome back. This is so fun. I'm glad that we've kind of made this an annual thing. If you joined me last year, we talked about Gilded Age gals, so the first ladies that served as such from about 1877 to 1900. So that took us all the way from Lucy Hayes all the way to Ida McKinley. Today we're shifting to be a bit more modern, although I assure you I will include historical context as we talk today about how first ladies themselves have taken their own whack at the glass ceiling. So happy St. Patrick's Day, happy Women's Month. I am going to get started here, and I do want to state that Firsts and Forwards, Cracking the Glass Ceiling from the East Wing, was initially created by the National First Ladies Library and Museum in partnership with the Canton Museum of Art for their Shattered Glass exhibit, which ran from November of last year through just the beginning of this month this year, and it was presented in support from Visit Canton and Arts and Stark in lieu of America 250. Just a bit more, you can see some of those logos there as well. You'll see the quote, empowered women empower women, quite a bit throughout this presentation as well. And I am talking about a lot of history, so please do feel free to put your Q&A in the chat or in the box, and I assure you I will try to answer as many questions as possible. And if I don't have the answer, I am always happy to share my information so that you can contact me and we can do some research together. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have had the chance to visit the National First Ladies Library Museum in Canton, Ohio, but we are founded by this woman in the center you see here. It's a really unique place to be. Mary Regula is our founder. You'll see her here, and unfortunately, she passed in 2018, but her legacy, like many of our First Ladies, lives on as well. When she was growing up, Mary Regula would listen to Eleanor Roosevelt on the radio during the Great Depression and was very inspired by her, as many people were in her generation, and even afterwards by Eleanor Roosevelt. When she got to college at Mount Union, Mary Regula became very interested in Mary Lincoln, who I know that name is very popular in Illinois as well. But unfortunately, at this point in American history and research and presidential research and scholarship, First ladies were maybe a footnote, a chapter, a paragraph. And so Mary Regula decided in the mid 1990s that there needed to be one place that was completely dedicated to the research and preservation of our nation's first ladies. And as such, the National First Ladies Library Museum was founded, and in 2000 partnered with the National Park Service to become the 380th unit of the National Park Service, which today has two buildings on our campus, one that is a main visitor center hosting exhibits, interpretive space, a Victorian theater, as well as several offices and archival storage space, as well as our original research library. We also maintain and preserve the childhood, home, and birthplace of our hometown hero, First Lady Ida Saxton McKinley, wife of President William McKinley. So if you haven't had a chance to come see us yet, there's no better time than America 250 or Women's History Month, so I hope to see you at the historic site soon. As I mentioned, we do have some exhibitions on display currently, so you can always tour the house, but we also have the Eras exhibit, 250 Years of First Ladies' Progress and Power on display that takes you through the entire course of American history, 250 years of the eras themselves that make up this wonderful nation's history, the First Ladies who helped to shape that history itself, and the women themselves who worked alongside First Ladies, regular women such as myself, who could have pushed forward progress, and like First Ladies, were unelected yet often pushing forward and advocating for change. So in 2016, a former First Lady of the United States became the forerunner of the Democratic Party, the only former First Lady in US history to do so. Now, despite winning the popular vote, Hillary Clinton ultimately conceded defeat in an especially contentious and close race to become President of the United States. In her concession speech, she famously stated, quote, "Now I know we have still not shattered that highest and hardest glass ceiling, but someday someone will, and hopefully sooner than we might think right now." But for a lot of people, they've never even heard the term glass ceiling. So, what did she even mean to people that had never heard that before? And what does it truly mean to even crack that invisible barrier? And that's exactly what the glass ceiling is. It was initially described as an invisible barrier specifically for women's advancement in the professional world. And this term was coined by Marilyn Loden, who you see pictured here. And she made history in 1978 when she first used the term the glass ceiling. Increasingly, this unacknowledged and invisible barrier has come to impact other minority groups who seek higher roles in politics, business, law, medicine, and other professions that have been historically monopolized by men. But decades before Clinton's candidacy, First Ladies were already stretching and at their own way cracking these limitations placed on women in public life. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, the first Black First Lady of the United States, transformed the role into a platform for service, advocacy, and opportunity. Born in Chicago, Illinois in January of 1964, to Fraser and Marion Robinson, she grew up in a household that valued education, hard work, and community responsibility. Excelling academically, she graduated from Princeton University in 1985 and earned her Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School in 1988, culminating a commitment to service and to opening doors for others. After law school, Michelle Robinson returned to Chicago, joining Sidley and Austin, where she then met and started to date Barack Obama. She later left corporate law to work in public service, holding positions at Chicago City Hall, Public Allies, the University of Chicago, and its hospital network. Alongside her career, she raised two daughters, Malia and Natasha, often known as Sasha, and supported her husband's political rise from Senate to the presidency. In 2009, as First Lady, Mrs. Obama used her unprecedented platform to break new ground. She launched Let's Move to combat childhood obesity, established the White House Kitchen Garden to provide fresh food, and promote nutrition, as well as co-founded Joining Forces to support military families. She championed education and opportunities through Reach Higher and Let Girls Learn, empowering young people, particularly young women, to pursue their lives' ambitions. She also reshaped the White House collection, introducing the first ever painting by a Black woman, Resurrection by Alma Thomas, and emphasized contemporary arts reflect the nation's growing diversity. Since leaving the White House, Mrs. Obama has continued her work in public service, education, and mentorship. Through her books, Becoming in 2018 and The Light We Carry in 2022, as well as through the Obama Foundation and Presidential Center, and her new podcast, she remains a model of leadership, resilience, and barrier-breaking achievement, showing that the role of the First Lady as a whole can be a platform for a lasting impact, as well as a catalyst for opening doors for others. Now, Laura Bush is often remembered for her calm and approachable public persona, but Laura Welch Bush used her platform to champion education, literacy, women's health, and civic engagement. She believed that access to knowledge and opportunities could break barriers for women, families, and communities across the United States and around the world. Born in Midland, Texas in 1946, Laura Welch grew up in a supportive family that, like the Robinson family, valued education and civic service. Welch earned a bachelor's degree in education from the Southern Methodist University and a master's in library science from the University of Texas at Austin, launching a career as a teacher and librarian. Her professional background instilled a lifelong commitment to learning, literacy, and empowering others through education. Following her marriage to George W. Bush in 1977, Mrs. Bush continued her career while supporting her husband's political ambitions. As First Lady from 2001 to 2009, she prioritized programs that promoted literacy, advocating that from early childhood, reading and education initiatives were essential. She even helped to create the Read Across America program and numerous library expansions. She highlighted the role of lifelong learning and access to educational resources for children and adults alike, with a particular focus on programs that would benefit young women and underserved communities. Mrs. Bush also championed women's health and rights nationally and globally. She led campaigns on breast cancer awareness and heart disease prevention, as well as spoke out in favor of maintaining access to reproductive health care, which, as you can imagine, articulated a nuanced defense at this time on women's bodily autonomy. Abroad, she focused on the plight of Afghani women, highlighting the importance of education, economic opportunity, and safety for women living under oppressive conditions, thus underscoring her belief that women's empowerment is essential in social progress. Laura Bush combined her professional expertise with her role as First Lady to encourage civic responsibility, service, and advocacy. She exemplified how a First Lady could use her visibility to strengthen the voices of women and children while breaking barriers in education, health, and global human rights. Through these efforts, Mrs. Bush reinforced the idea that women's advancement, both locally, nationally, and internationally, is a key measure of societal progress and a challenge to glass ceilings everywhere. Hillary Rodham Clinton, who we briefly already talked about, transformed the role of First Lady into a platform of policy, advocacy, as well as breaking barriers. Born in October of 1947 in Chicago, Illinois, she grew up in a middle-class family that encouraged education, civic engagement, and intellectual curiosity. She attended Wellesley College, graduating with honors, and earned her law degree from Yale University, where she first met Bill Clinton. From the start, she was determined to combine professional accomplishment with public service, which would then set the stage for a lifetime of leadership. As First Lady of the United States from 1993 to 2001, Mrs. Clinton reshaped public expectations for what a First Lady could do and accomplish in her role. She was the first to hold a professional staff in her own right, although we acknowledge that Rosalind Carter and Pat Nixon have some of the first East Wing staffs in U.S. history. Now, that being said, Mrs. Clinton was deeply passionate about healthcare reform, children's welfare, domestic violence prevention, and early childhood education. She advocated for family and women across the country, championing policies that expanded access to healthcare, improved schools, and helped to protect women from abusive relationships and exploitive situations. She also pressed for legislation to strengthen workplace protections and opportunities for women, consistently challenged societal and professional barriers, and to this day is one of the only First Ladies to actually have operated herself out of the West Wing rather than the East Wing. Her advocacy extended globally. In 1995, at the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, Mrs. Clinton delivered a landmark speech declaring that, quote, "Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights." She drew attention to the systemic inequalities that women face worldwide, including violence, restricted educational opportunities, and barriers for political participation, setting a precedent for future First Ladies and global leaders alike. Throughout her tenure, she traveled extensively, meeting with women and girls in dozens of countries, promoting leadership, education, and individual economic empowerment. Mrs. Clinton also pioneered new forms of public engagement. She held press conferences, testified before Congress, and managed national policy projects, acts that were unprecedented for someone in her role at this time. An advocate for the voices of women, children, and marginalized communities, she represented these folks in national discourse and consistently bridged domestic priorities with international perspectives, demonstrating that leadership and advocacy need not be confined to the East Wing nor the White House walls. Even after her tenure as First Lady, Hillary Clinton continued breaking barriers. She became the first former First Lady elected to the U.S. Senate, representing the state of New York. There, she advanced economic, health, and security issues. As Secretary of State, she navigated complex global challenges while still promoting women's political participation, education, democracy, and empowerment worldwide. Her career has been marked by numerous firsts, all tied to the principle that women's leadership and agency are critical in an equitable society. Clinton also helped to establish lasting institutional frameworks for women's leadership, including her own role in the creation of the National First Ladies Library, now and Museum, located in Canton, Ohio, dedicated to preserving and interpreting the lives of America's First Ladies. Throughout every role, Hillary Clinton has combined intellect, determination, and dedication to equality, leaving a lasting impact of leadership, advocacy, and the relentless pursuit of breaking that glass ceiling, both in the United States and around the world. Though she did not quite yet shatter that highest and hardest glass ceiling, her career ultimately cracked it, reshaping public expectations of women's political power and leadership in the United States and beyond. And I apologize, I should have said this at the beginning. I'm actually working my way back through the women's movement, through this very important history. We're going to go all the way back to the first time someone used the term glass ceiling, the women that came afterwards, as well as the women who came before this was even a formalized idea. So with that being said, I want to talk a bit more about the Equal Rights Amendment in itself. First proposed in 1923 amid the women's suffrage movement, the Equal Rights Amendment was set forth by the woman you see pictured here, Alice Paul. She first introduced the amendment at Seneca Falls at the first ever Women's Rights Convention in 1848. This amendment was introduced to expand the rights that were guaranteed through the United States Constitution, and Paul agreed that, quote, "we shall not be safe until the principle of equal rights is written into the framework of our government." Supporters of the amendment would eventually go on to rally, picket, march, and petition for its passage, including some who would even commit acts of civil disobedience to further its charge, which we especially see historically from about 1972 to 1982. Now, during this period, there were several First Ladies of the United States who not only supported the passage of the ERA, or Equal Rights Amendment, but who also participated in its progress. Betty Ford stands as one of the most influential first ladies in the history of women's rights, using her position to challenge political convention and to advance the cause of legal equality for women. Born Elizabeth Bloomer in 1918 and raised primarily in Grand Rapids, Michigan, she entered public life with a strong sense of independence shaped by professional training, self-sufficiency, and an admiration for First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and her model of principled public engagement. As First Lady of the United States from 1974 to 1977, Betty Ford emerged as the most visible national advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment within the executive branch. At a time when many political leaders treated the ERA as a controversial or politically risky endeavor, she framed it as a necessary constitutional guarantee of equal protection under the law. She moved beyond symbolic endorsement, directly lobbying members of Congress and state legislators, meeting with advocacy organizations, and using her public appearances to argue that equality was fundamental in American democracy. Her outspoken support generated intense backlash, as you can probably imagine, particularly from conservative groups. Yet she remained unwavering, insisting that women's rights were neither partisan nor optional. Betty Ford further expanded the boundaries of acceptable public discourse by linking the ERA to broader issues on women's autonomy, including access to childcare, reproductive choice, and economic opportunity. Her willingness to articulate these positions publicly redefined expectations placed on First Ladies and opened space for women to publicly speak with authority on policy rather than what were just deemed as merely social causes. Now, equally transformative was her leadership on women's health. Following a 1974 breast cancer diagnosis, Mrs. Ford chose unprecedented transparency, prompting a nationwide increase in breast cancer screenings and public awareness. Later, her openness about her own mental health and substance dependency challenged long-standing stigmas and reinforced her belief that equality must also include access to care, dignity, respect, and transparency, as well as honesty. Even after leaving the White House, Betty Ford remained a steadfast advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, appearing at rallies, speaking at national conferences, and lending her leadership to the ERA Countdown campaign in its final push in 1982. Through sustained advocacy, personal risk, and moral clarity, Betty Ford lowered critical barriers for women and permanently expanded the role of First Lady as a force for constitutional equality and social change. In 2009, Betty Ford became the third longest living First Lady at the age of 91, and in 2011 passed at the age of 93 years old, laid to rest in the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Grand Rapids, Michigan. What's unique about this is that her funeral was attended by all living former First Ladies or current First Ladies at the time, including Rosalind Carter, Nancy Reagan, Hillary Clinton, and then incumbent First Lady Michelle Obama. Now, Pat Nixon unfortunately remains to this day one of the most overlooked First Ladies and yet one of the most consequential in advancing women's visibility and access to public life. She was the first First Lady herself to earn a graduate level education and entered public service with a deep appreciation for hard work, self-sufficiency, and education shaped by her experiences of growing up during the Great Depression. As both Second Lady and First Lady, then of the United States, Mrs. Nixon transformed the expectations of a political partnership through tireless engagement with the public. She was among the most traveled First Ladies in American history, visiting more than 50 countries and serving as a goodwill ambassador who emphasized humanitarian outreach, women's education, and community development. Her international work, including independent diplomatic travels to Africa, as well as her leadership during disaster relief efforts in Peru following a devastating earthquake in 1970, demonstrated the growing global role of women in American diplomacy. Now, domestically, Pat Nixon used her position to emphasize accessibility and inclusion. She actively and steadfastly worked to make the White House more welcoming and accessible for everyday Americans, expanding public tours, improving access for visitors with disabilities, and providing multilingual materials for non-English speakers. Referring to the executive mansion as the People's House, which we know it as today, Mrs. Nixon reframed the executive mansion as a shared civic space, our house, rather than just an exclusive political symbol. Nixon also took notable public stands on women's rights and became the First Lady to endorse the Equal Rights Amendment publicly, supporting reproductive choice as well following the Roe v. Wade decision, something that her husband's administration did not want to talk about. She advocated for the appointment of women to the Supreme Court and used her visibility to encourage women's political participation at a moment when advocacy from a First Lady like this was far from expected. Now, despite her marginalization during the Watergate crisis and her subsequent retreat from public life, Pat Nixon's legacy reflects a First Lady who quietly but decisively expanded access, visibility, and opportunity for women and the public at large. Her activism through sustained engagement, institutional change, and an insistence that government remain connected to the people it serves stands as a lasting legacy in American history. Lady Bird Johnson is another unique First Lady that I think is not getting her due justice, and I'm so glad when we get the opportunity to talk about her. Now, often and probably most remembered for her environmental legacy, First Lady Lady Bird Johnson also used her public role to challenge expectations placed on women and to expand their presence in political life. Quietly but deliberately, she demonstrated that influence, advocacy, and leadership cannot coexist with the traditional ideas of femininity, pushing against the glass ceilings of her era from within the East Wing. Born Claudia Alta Taylor in 1912 in Karnak, Texas, Lady Bird Johnson showed early intellectual curiosity and ambition. She earned degrees in history and journalism from the University of Texas at Austin, completing her studies with honors. Shortly after her second graduation, she met Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the two were married in 1934. From the outset of their partnership, Lady Bird Johnson played an essential and active role in her husband's political career while maintaining her own professional identity as a successful businesswoman in radio and media. As a congressional spouse during the Great Depression, Mrs. Johnson became increasingly aware of the social and economic inequalities faced by Americans across the nation. She forged connections with influential women, including Eleanor Roosevelt, whose example reinforced her belief that women could and should shape public life through advocacy and action. During the 1960 presidential campaign, it was Lady Bird Johnson who assumed an unusually visible role, traveling extensively in support of the Democratic ticket. Her campaign work, including the Lady Bird Johnson Special Whistle Stop campaign, emphasized compassion, unity, and civil rights, and she insisted on racially integrated events wherever she spoke, making inclusion a non-negotiable principle of her public appearances. Following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, Lady Bird Johnson entered the White House during a moment of national grief and political transition. As First Lady, she became a trusted advisor to President Johnson and a visible presence during the passage of landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In fact, she was the only woman present at its signing, a powerful reminder of how few women actually occupied these formal and political spaces of political authority. Beyond her widely recognized beautification initiatives, First Lady Johnson also consistently advanced women's leadership and professional achievement. She created Women Doer luncheons, which brought women leaders, artists, activists, and policymakers into the White House to discuss contemporary issues facing society, including, of course, women. These gatherings underscored her belief that women belong in conversations that shape national priorities, even when their perspectives may have challenged some prevailing policies. Women's health and equality remained central to her advocacy. Lady Bird Johnson supported increased educational opportunities for women and received numerous honorary degrees recognizing her commitment to women's advancement. In the years following her time in the White House, she became increasingly vocal in her support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Her public appearances alongside Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter, including at the 1977 National Women's Conference and later at the ERA rallies, marked a clear and deliberate endorsement of gender equality by law. Through political partnership, public advocacy, and sustained commitment to women's advancement, Lady Bird Johnson redefined the possibilities of her first ladyship. Her legacy reflects how women working within traditional structures could still challenge the limitations set forth before them, expand influence, and help to pave the way towards a more inclusive vision of leadership in the United States. If you're interested in literature on several of these first ladies, I'm so pleased to share that in 2024, I believe it was, a new full scope biography of Pat Nixon came out by Heath Hardage Lee. It's the first ever biography of Pat Nixon in over 40 years. There was also just 2 or 3 new books released about First Lady Bird Johnson. Many historians claiming that the Johnson administration wouldn't even be what it was in its successes without Mrs. Johnson advocating for policy change and equality. Now, this is a lot of the latter part of the 20th century. As we shift into the earlier 20th century, I do want to disclose that cultural expectations were definitely different, but they still allowed first ladies to step more assertively into public advocacy. Eleanor Roosevelt, Lou Hoover, and others used emerging media, professional networks, and civic leadership to expand the possibilities for women in public life. Sorry, excuse me. Ooh. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt did not enter the White House quietly, nor did she leave it quietly or unchanged. And I'm sure many of you, this is probably your favorite First Lady because she did so much in her entire life. I get people that ask for an Eleanor Roosevelt program, and I say, well, what of her life? And they say, well, this part. And I'm like, well, that's 3 hours in itself. World War II. Well, do you want the My Day column? Do you want her on the road? Do you want her visiting camps? There's so much that this woman did that forever changed the role of First Lady. And I'm sure many of you are very aware of that. Now, that being said, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was shaped by early loss in her life and some personal adversity to make her into who she was today. She transformed personal hardship into lifelong commitments to justice, equality, and women's advancement, often pressing against barriers that had long limited women's public power. Born in New York City in 1884, Eleanor Roosevelt experienced profound loss at a young age, being orphaned by 10 and then being raised by her maternal grandmother. Her education at Allenswood Academy in London proved to be very pivotal, especially where her mentor, Marie Souvestre, encouraged intellectual independence as well as social responsibility. These formative experiences prepared Eleanor Roosevelt to question traditional expectations as well as to challenge the invisible ceilings that she noticed were being placed above women in civic life. Upon returning to the United States, she completely immersed herself into progressive era reform movements, working in settlement houses and later advocacy organizations that exposed her to the realities of poverty, unsafe working conditions, and gender inequality. As the First Lady of the United States from 1933 to 1945, Mrs. Roosevelt fundamentally expanded the reach and authority of the role. She understood the White House as a platform not simply for ceremony, but for action. At a time when women were often excluded from economic recovery efforts, it was First Lady Roosevelt who advocated for their inclusion in New Deal programs and pressed federal agencies to recognize women as workers, professionals, and heads of households. Working closely with leaders such as Molly Dewson, she helped to open doors for qualified women through the Roosevelt administrative, actively challenging gender barriers embedded within federal policy and positions. Mrs. Roosevelt also convened White House conferences focused on women's concerns, elevating issues such as fair wages, workplace protections, access to education, and women's roles in national defense. Through public speeches, press engagement, and her daily presence in political spaces alone that were traditionally dominated by men, Eleanor Roosevelt repeatedly tested and stretched and tried to crack at that glass ceiling of women's political influence, and in doing so demonstrated that women belonged in policy conversations at the highest levels of government. Following her years in the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt continued to break barriers on the global stage. Appointed by then President Harry Truman as a United States delegate to the newly formed United Nations, Mrs. Roosevelt became a driving force behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In her later years, Mrs. Roosevelt emerged as a vocal advocate for pay equity and also, before her death, publicly supported the Equal Rights Amendment, recognizing it as a necessary step towards dismantling the legal and institutional challenges that continued to limit women's equality. Her final public service as chair of the President's Commission on the Status of Women helped lay essential groundwork for future advances in women's rights and policy. Eleanor Roosevelt's funeral was attended the first by former and current First Ladies, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. That being said, it was attended by Bess Truman, Jacqueline Kennedy, and then future First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. Now, Lou Hoover's reputation, similar to Pat Nixon, unfortunately seems to often be tied with the unpopularity and, at times, scandals of their husband's administration. And unfortunately, it's such a tragedy because Lou Henry Hoover was such a fabulous and unique woman. Throughout her life, she continued to push against limitations placed on women in public life and academia, quietly expanding what leadership could look like for American women during a time of crisis and change amid the Great Depression. Born in March of 1874, Lou Henry grew up in an unconventional household of the time. It encouraged intellectual curiosity, physical independence and wellness, and civic responsibility. From an early age, Lou Henry challenged prevailing expectations of womanhood through her love of athletics, outdoor exploration, and academic rigor. Her education culminated in Stanford University, where she became the first ever in U.S. history woman to earn a degree in geology from the institution, which, as you can probably guess, was an extraordinary achievement in a male-dominated STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics field. This early crossing of professional and intellectual barriers helped to shape her lifelong belief that women were fully capable of leadership, scholarship, and service. Before even entering the White House, Lou Hoover lived a global and public life. She traveled extensively, mastered multiple languages, and even translated a foundational mining or metallurgical text, if you will, from Latin to English. She then also held leadership roles in international efforts during World War I when she was abroad in Great Britain and Belgium. And these experiences prepared her to navigate complex political, humanitarian, and organizational challenges, even if her work often unfolded outside of the spotlight. As First Lady of the United States from 1929 until 1933, Lou Hoover entered the White House at a moment of unprecedented crisis. The onset of the Great Depression dramatically reshaped her role and expectations. While she chose a reserved public persona, her actions behind the scenes reveal a First Lady who was deeply committed to modernizing the position and advocating for women's advancement. Lou Hoover became the first First Lady in U.S. history to deliver a nationwide radio address, using then modern and brand new media to communicate directly with Americans, thus setting a precedent for those who followed. Throughout her time in the White House, First Lady Hoover consistently promoted the idea that women belonged in civic, professional, and public spaces. She also publicly emphasized shared responsibility between men and women in domestic labor, arguing that boys and men should also learn household skills alongside girls and young women. She supported expanded educational opportunities for women, personally even funding higher education for several young women, and she herself received numerous honorary degrees in recognition of her leadership. Now, perhaps her most enduring contribution to women's advancement in history was her work with the Girl Scouts of America. Serving as honorary president, Lou Hoover played a critical role in expanding the organization's national reach and infrastructure. She helped to raise significant funds to support the long-term growth of the organization and encourage Girl Scouts to embrace inclusivity, civic engagement, and leadership training. Under her influence, and during the Great Depression, she mobilized the Girl Scouts to assist with community relief efforts, encouraging young women to identify needs in their communities and to also take an active role in addressing those needs. Lou Hoover also supported broader efforts to dismantle professional barriers for women. Some historians even believe that she influenced President Hoover's 1932 executive order, which permitted federal job appointments regardless of sex or biological identity. While this influence was often subtle, It did reflect her deeply held belief that education and opportunity were key in women's long-term success. Now, despite her significant efforts, Lou Hoover's legacy was overshadowed by the economic devastation of the Great Depression, as well as criticism of the Hoover administration at large. Only after her death did the full extent of her private generosity become known, revealing that across and throughout the Great Depression, she had quietly provided financial assistance out of her own personal pocket to hundreds of struggling Americans and then often refused repayment. Lou Henry Hoover did not shatter the glass ceiling with public spectacle, but she steadily widened the cracks through intellect, service, and leadership. Her legacy reminds us that both progress and power for women has often been built not through just visibility, but also through persistence, preparation, and principled action. Now, prior to and quickly following the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted all white women the right to vote in the United States, Ida McKinley, Florence Harding, and others actively used visibility, symbolism, and influence to signal their support for women's political participation and social reform at large. Now, Florence Harding is sometimes considered to be one of the most active and progressive first ladies prior to Eleanor Roosevelt. Some historians even argue that she was the first to modernize the role prior to First Lady Roosevelt. And she was a trailblazer in political engagement, women's equality, and social reform. As the first future First Lady in U.S. history to be able to vote in a presidential election following the 19th Amendment, she embodied the belief that women's voices must be active, visible, and influential in public life. Born in August of 1860 in Marion, Ohio, Florence Kling grew up in a wealthy, socially prominent household. The eldest of three children, she studied classical piano at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, aspiring to become a financially independent woman as an internationally recognized concert pianist. While unusual for women of her time, her father actually encouraged this independence through practical skills, including piano, as well as an early study in business. Florence Kling even worked in the family's hardware and machinery store, honing organizational and leadership skills that would later define her public life. At 19, Florence Kling endured a challenging early marriage that ended in divorce, leaving her to support herself and her young son. She began teaching piano lessons, maintaining both her financial independence and personal agency while cultivating a growing confidence in navigating a world that was not friendly to single or divorced women. Her path eventually led her to Warren G. Harding, whom she married in 1891, and from the start, she was engaged deeply in her husband's career, managing social and political contexts, overseeing finances, and even stepping in to run as manager his newspaper, the Marion Star, when he was absent due to health issues. And as such, a lot of the paper's success was due to his wife, Florence Kling Harding. As First Lady from 1921 to 1923, Mrs. Harding completely redefined the role with a dual commitment to both tradition and modern advancement. She actively promoted women's political engagement. She hosted federal women workers at the White House, young graduates, and even women of color to the White House. She publicly emphasized the importance of voting for women and encouraged civic participation, reinforcing the principle that women belonged in public life. She also very subtly addressed the issue of birth control, refusing to condemn the movement when she was questioned by the press, signaling support for early women's reproductive agency at a time when very few public figures would. Mrs. Harding's advocacy also extended to professional and social reform. She was a driving force behind the creation of the Alderson Reformatory Prison, the first ever federal correctional institution exclusively designed for women in the United States, which emphasized rehabilitation and vocational training to ensure that women who were down on their luck or leaving jail could actually earn their own living without the dependence on men or charity. She championed the humane treatment of women inmates and worked with a coalition of organizations, including the American Association of University Women and the League of Women Voters, to protect and empower incarcerated women and suffragettes. She also actively celebrated and highlighted professional women, welcoming luminaries such as Madame Marie Curie to the White House to illustrate the value of women's contribution in science. Through these efforts, she demonstrated that women could and should achieve success, and that recognition equal to men is worthy of them in multiple spheres. Now, Florence Harding's tenure as First Lady was cut short by her husband's death in 1923, yet her impact still remains. Her dedication to women's advancement, civic responsibility, equality, set a precedent for First Ladies as public figures who could champion these causes and more. She showed that breaking through societal expectations was not just possible, but as you've already heard several times, it is essential in democracy and public life. During the late Victorian period, before women even had the right to vote, the eras of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age, the First Ladies who lived during this period used the White House and their platforms for influence, often in times of national crisis or moments of transition. These women, Ida McKinley, Caroline Harrison, Frances Cleveland, and Lucy Hayes, all balanced personal tragedy, familial obligations, and public expectations while quietly advancing causes that were important to women and society as a whole, being firsts in their own ways. Although the organized women's rights movement was still gaining momentum during this period, with leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and Susan B. Anthony emerging during this period, the first ladies of these times demonstrated early leadership, broke social barriers, and supported causes that reflected women's growing public personas. Their efforts laid the groundwork for activism, making these early shapers of the glass ceiling that future generations would confront. So just some high-level information about some of these women that are just deeply fascinating before we even had the right to vote. Ida McKinley, who served as First Lady from 1897 to 1901, expanded women's visibility in public life at a time when political participation still seemed just out of reach. Educated and financially capable, she assisted in her family's bank and understood the importance of women's economic independence. She openly supported women's suffrage, becoming the First Lady to publicly declare her support for this cause and movement. Now, despite chronic illness and personal losses, she remained a visible presence at official events. She welcomed women leaders to the White House and used her position to support charitable and educational causes. Caroline Harrison, who served from 1889 until her death in 1892, brought education, artistry, and progressive vision to the White House. As First Lady, she oversaw the installation of electricity in the executive mansion, refinished rooms, and actually was the first to ever institute the Christmas tree tradition, modernizing the residence for new eras to come. She championed women's advancement, even opening her China painting classes to the public and DC women, and helped to raise funds for Johns Hopkins Medical School on the condition that it now begin to admit women. One of her most impactful contributions as First Lady includes her founding of and serving as its first general president of the Daughters of the American Revolution, or today the DAR. So if any of you are part of the Daughters of the American Revolution, you can thank First Lady Caroline Harrison for that idea. And if you're still itching to learn more about suffrage and Ida McKinley, we can also thank her for her early advocacy and public support of this cause. Now, likewise, other First Ladies of these eras, such as Frances Cleveland, really changed history. Frances Cleveland served from 1886 to 1889, and then again in 1893 to 1897, and thus was the First Lady prior to Melania Trump to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in U.S. history. She was also the youngest First Lady in U.S. history and married President Grover Cleveland when she was 21 years old and he was 37 years her senior. She stepped into a highly public role that made her a national sensation overnight. Well educated at Wells College, she supported women's advancement through White House salons that were specifically opened for working class women who otherwise would not get the opportunity to visit the executive mansion. She also sponsored scholarships for female musicians and supported initiatives like the Washington Home for Friendless Colored Girls. Now, before her, Lucy Webb Hayes, who served from 1877 to 1881, was the first in U.S. history, the First Lady to earn a college degree, graduating from the Cincinnati Wesleyan Female College. A woman of intellect, moral conviction, and grace, she actively supported her husband's military and political career while advocating causes for children, education, and those who had been recently emancipated. Known as Mother Lucy during the Civil War for her visits to soldiers' camps, she comforted the wounded and supported families of service members. And we do know that Lucy Webb Hayes, prior to her marriage, attended a very early women's suffrage seminar led by famous suffragette Lucy Stone. We're going all the way back to the beginning now at this point, folks. Long before the notion of a glass ceiling even existed, Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, recognized the systemic inequality early on in our democracy based on gender. As the new nation moved towards independence, she observed that women were largely excluded from political power and they lacked legal protections. In her now famous letter to her husband, that was written in March of 1776, she wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Mrs. Adams' correspondence shows that even in the earliest days of this nation, she asserted women's rights were worthy of recognition and influence. Through her advocacy, intellect, and political engagement, she set the tone for women in American public life for generations to come, paving the way for all of these first ladies and more that I've talked about, and for the ongoing struggle for gender equality. Now, I do want to highlight some really important statistics. By 2025, the global picture of gender equality reflected both meaningful progress and some persistent limits. According to the United Nations Women's Page, between 2022 and 2024, 2.9 billion women and girls in more than 80 countries gained stronger legal protections for their rights. During the same period, dozens of nations expanded services for survivors of gender-based violence. Thousands of organizations strengthened their capacity to support women, and millions of women and girls in crisis received life-saving assistance. These gains echo the history traced throughout my program that you've listened to this evening, and thanks for sticking it out with me. Like the first ladies who pushed boundaries long before formal equality was possible, much of this progress came through gradual change rather than dramatic breakthroughs or, glass shattering moments. At the same time, the barriers remain clear. Globally, women hold only about 30% of managerial positions, and at the current pace, equal representation in leadership is still believed to be decades, if not generations away. In sectors tied closely to power and innovation, the gaps are even wider. Women make up less than a third of the global technology workforce, and only a small share hold leadership roles. As I mentioned earlier, the glass ceiling has also begun to encompass other minority groups, and many statistics are further exacerbated for women of color, women and men within the LGBTQ plus community, and other minority groups. The United States reflects similar patterns, as does UN, which kind of takes a global perspective. Women remain underrepresented in management, and in 2021, women working full-time in the US earned about 76 cents for every dollar earned by men, equivalent in their field or position. Reports of workplace harassment and discrimination continue to underscore that the glass ceiling is not only structural, but cultural. Yet progress, as history reminds us, it is rarely linear. Federal reports also point to forward movement, including expanded access to reproductive health care for students, improved service for women veterans, and continued advances in support of survivors who have endured and survived domestic violence. Now, together, these developments mirror the work of First Ladies who use their influence and heightened position rather than elected authority, visibility rather than votes, and all of this to widen opportunity. Taken together, these realities reinforce the central truth of this program. The glass ceiling has been cracked, it's been stretched, it's been reshaped, and it's been challenged over time, but it has not yet disappeared, nor has it been dramatically shattered. Like the women of the East Wing before them, today's advocates continue to push against barriers that is so thin and thinner than it has ever been, yet still very much intact. From Abigail Adams's early call to remember the ladies to the advocacy and leadership of our most contemporary First Ladies, we see a through line of women using their position, visibility, and influence to challenge barriers and expand opportunity. These First Ladies, though they are unelected and unpaid for their time, have consistently chosen to stand for progress, Whether it be supporting education, health, civil rights, equality, they paved the way for future generations of women, men, and young learners alike. Yet, by most measures, as I said, the glass ceiling remains. Women continue to face systemic barriers in politics, business, science, and beyond. But what these first ladies demonstrate is that leadership, courage, and advocacy really can crack the glass ceiling, inspiring and challenging change with that within existing structures. Their legacies remind us that progress is possible, that visibility really does matter, and that each act of service, mentorship, or advocacy, especially when done with intention, contributes to a broader path towards equality for all. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now, but I want to thank you all for letting me talk to you all again for Women's History Month.
Stephanie, thank you so, oh, I froze. Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation.
Thank
We
you.
have some questions. I have a feeling
Great.
we'll go a smidgen over 8, so I hope you can bear with us for a little bit. And
I'm in it.
everyone at home, if you can't, you're welcome to jump on or off. But thank you again so much. Alrighty, I'm gonna try and hit them in the order they came in. The first question came, do you know if there is still a White House kitchen garden?
That's a great question. Right now, the White House is undergoing a lot of renovations.
Mhm.
So we know that the Rose Garden, unfortunately, is no longer with us, as are several parts of the actual East Wing. I believe that the White House garden used for food and nutrition is not actively being used at this time. That's a great question.
Wonderful. This one I think is a very interesting question. And you kind of touched on it with, I can't remember which one. Pat Nixon, I think.
Hmm.
With has any first lady opposed policies, stand, or action of their husbands?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And I think that's really unique. I had the pleasure of speaking in Mount Vernon at the beginning of March, and I got asked that exact same question. And luckily, I was on a panel with Colleen Shogan, who's the first ever female archivist of the United States. And she had a lot of really interesting presidential perspectives that I was able to then work with from the First Lady. And yes, short answer is yes. As independent voters, some of these women are actually registered as different parties and then switch when they marry their husbands. But we believe they still hold on to some of their original held beliefs. For example, Pat Nixon herself was a registered Democrat and it's tough because she wasn't a diehard fan of Eleanor Roosevelt, but she respected her prevalence in American
Mhm.
society. So she was a registered Democrat voter and then actually voted Republican upon marrying Nixon. But the Nixon family dynamics are interesting in their own way because the Nixons were raised in the Quaker faith, which actually kind of modeled a matriarchy. So we believe that Pat Nixon was still treated very much as an equal intellectually, emotionally, and socially to her husband. But yes, Betty Ford walked out of a session of Congress when they decided not to pass the ERA. And that was during her husband's term as president. So, yes, they have at times balked at what their husband's administration might be pushing
Mhm.
forward. And the first ladies that came out in support of the ERA or even in form of birth control or Roe v. Wade, Laura Bush's moment that I discussed earlier, she remained in favor of women's bodily autonomy, even when the George Bush administration was trying to do its the first time that one of the first times that Roe v. Wade was trying to be rolled back, and so she actually publicly stated that she believed that was an important amendment to the Constitution.
I did think it's like so powerful to see people just doing that
Mhm.
and to see people who feel comfortable allowing themselves to express and listen and just so snaps for these ladies. Just blown away.
Absolutely.
Um, we have really quick because you brought up, I think this was Betty Ford. Um, what was she the one who had the first mama pin?
Yes. Oh,
What
yes. I
what
love
is
that one.
that? Everyone has amazing questions, but I'm so why what how first mama how? I just need to know everything.
So a lot of first ladies, a lot of what they do, and I also see the comments coming in. I want to clarify that we recognize that both Melania Trump and Dr. Jill Biden have done a lot to advance women's history. And it was even tough to include Michelle Obama and Laura Bush because all four of these women are still alive and their legacies are still being cemented and formed as we speak. So the coverage that we do, even the coverage that I've done tonight on Michelle Obama is already outdated because she's always doing something. So I assure you, at the National First Ladies Library Museum, we are regularly keeping our finger on the pulse of what these First Ladies are doing. And it was really tough to pick and choose because, as several comments say, Betty Ford, Bess Truman, Jill Biden, Melania Trump, Michelle Obama, if I could, I would highlight every single First Lady. I tried to use the Equal Rights Amendment and suffrage as my two linchpins here. Now, that being said, the first mama, a lot of First Ladies, some of their persona is kind of relegated to them also being a mother, and their motherhood itself shapes the role of First Lady. And each First Lady kind of handles it differently. Julia Grant was at one point criticized for how much she exposed her family to the press. And then Jacqueline Kennedy ended up taking someone to court because they weren't giving her and her family enough privacy in the press. So the first mama pin is kind of a nod to, she was kind of seen as a mama bear, Betty Ford. And there's a lot of interesting moments of Betty Ford's life. The one slide I had showed her winning Woman of the Year. So she was a pretty dynamic gal. And so the first mama pin is kind of a fun campaign piece of her life.
I mean, it sold me, and like that's from a period where I wasn't voting. I was like, that's hilarious, and I love it. That's my vibe. And thank you so much for also clocking and answering. I'm not gonna lie, y'all. I could have actively sat here and I think had her go through the 40 plus first ladies and not have batted an eye. I
And I
was
would
just
love
so
to.
sucked in. And I see like there's also somebody just asked about Jackie Kennedy, and I mean that she's what at least 20 programs in and of
Well,
herself.
that's the thing. It's similar to Eleanor Roosevelt. I actually have two programs that I offer just on Jacqueline Kennedy alone. One is all about her relations with the press and the media, and one is just her full life because she did so much. So it's tough when we talk about first ladies like Jacqueline Kennedy and Eleanor Roosevelt, and even our most contemporary first ladies, because they do so much. And
Mhm.
especially with our modern day social media and press and media, it's difficult to even keep track of every single thing that first ladies are doing. Now, that being said, I do have to do a shameless plug for East Wing magazine. They are fabulous. It's a completely digital newsletter. You can subscribe for free or you can do a paid subscription. But that is the only newspaper in the world that reports on First Lady's history as it's being made. And it's not just the current First Lady, it's other scholarship that's coming about, new ones, new books, book reviews, podcasts, and just kind of keeping you up to date on what's happening with all of these First Ladies. It's really fascinating. I cannot recommend it enough. Jennifer Taylor and her team at East Wing Magazine are fabulous.
Wonderful. All right, so we have officially gone over time. I want to make sure I want to wrap with I'm going to slam these two questions here into one. Um, and then I'm going to before I ask those, I'm going to quickly shamelessly plug. Stephanie's mentioned like there's so many materials on the different first ladies. I know for a fact we have a bunch of books about them in our collection here at the library. And don't forget, if we don't have what you're looking for, we can get it for you. You can recommend a purchase through our website. You can ask us to do it through interlibrary loan. If you want to learn more, especially as we're celebrating Women's History Month and continuing learning for America 250, because I don't know if you've all picked up on this yet. I'm not just having us learn about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence this year. I want us to learn about every fun thing that makes America America
Mm-hmm.
over the past 250 years. And First Ladies is one of our first and stops, and one I'm so glad we took. So to wrap up, kind of a shameless plug for the museum, Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
A patron wanted to know, just out of curiosity, how was Canton decided for the museum? And now another patron, same patron actually, was curious about if there was a Barbara Bush exhibit. I'm actually going to ever so slightly
Mm-hmm.
shift that question. Do you have online digital exhibits and resources for patrons who are interested in learning more about any of the First Ladies you spoke on tonight or ones you weren't able to cover?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were founded as a research library. We ended up tacking on museum much later. So we do still have some of our original research folders and files. We also book appointments in our research library with our senior curator, who helps with collections and um, research requests. She's fabulous. She is a wealth of knowledge. She has written chapters and helped write books. Which actually brings me to part of the answer on Ida McKinley, especially because the house that we maintain and preserve is her birthplace. And there are so few well documented First Lady birthplaces, as well as if they are documented, they've been destroyed or morphed into something else. So the fact that we've got this beautiful little treasure trove of Victorian architecture, history, First Lady, and presidential history makes it a really unique spot in Canton, Ohio. And then on top of it, the house is also the last documented place that we can say President William McKinley lived, as his childhood home in Niles, Ohio burned down and was later reconstructed, but not authentic or original. And the house that Ida and William McKinley rented when they first got married has also been since torn down. So it makes it a unique place if you're a presidential or even an Ohio presidential fan, because there are many who called Ohio home. That's part of the reason. And then Canton, Ohio is also the home to the National Football Hall of Fame. And our founder, Mary Regulus, said, if we can have a Hall of Fame for football, why can't we have one for First Ladies? So, that being said, we are working on actively digitizing more of our items. We are in the process of uploading our entire collection to Catalog It, which is a cataloging system, which hopefully by this summer will be publicly on our research page on our website. So you can even see some of our priceless artifacts, letters. I love the White House menus from diplomatic dinners. I love those. So definitely stay tuned. If you don't already follow us on social media or subscribe to our email newsletter, now's the time. We'd love to have you. It's just www.firstladies.org, pretty short, sweet, and to the point. And feel free to explore our website. Our contact information is there as well if you'd like to know more. And Barbara Bush is currently on display, as our exhibit talks about every First Lady, and was also on display last year for her literacy efforts, as that was our featured exhibit for 2024 to 2025. I hope that answers the question fully, Chris.
Yeah, oh, more than.
Excellent.
Stephanie, thank you
Excellent.
so much again. Everybody, don't worry. Also, in the after action email that you'll be getting is a link to the First Ladies Library Museum website. So you'll have smooth access to that. And of course, I can't wrap without a shameless plug for the next session in our Night with the Museum series, which is also going to be America 250 themed, a little bit more dark and mysterious. I believe if you guys have been with me from the start, one of our first museums that we hosted was the Mob Museum from Las Vegas. They, much like First Ladies, are making a reappearance this year for us, and their educator, Claire White, is building a whole program just for us about 250 years of organized crime, going all the way back to street gangs and smuggling back in the 1700s, taking us all the way to the 1970s, where the mafia and the mob as we know it comes into notoriety. So I really hope you guys are able to join us for that. That's live on our website now to register for. That's going to be Tuesday, April 21st from 7 to 8 p.m. There's also a link for oh, I should cover where the mic is. There's also a link for that in the after action email, so don't worry about that one either. But until next time, happy Women's History Month, happy St. Patrick's Day, happy primary election day. Stephanie, thank you so much. I can't
Thank you.
fathom I won't have you back. I have to. They need to
Anytime.
know about Jill Biden and Melania and Jackie
All of
and
them.
and and I and Rosalind Carter and everyone. So we have to do at least what 44 more of these.
We've got plenty of time. I'm launching a new program at the end of this month. That's kind of an America 250. So we're going to highlight some other lesser known First Ladies. I'm developing a Lady Bird Johnson program, as well as a First Ladies Along the Lincoln Highway program this summer. So definitely stay tuned. We're developing a lot. We're trying to move things forward. And I'd love to welcome you to the site. So thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all. It's always a pleasure to speak with you this time around the year.
Wonderful. All right. Well, until next time, we'll see y'all later. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.